Well, greetings to everyone, and welcome to another New Jersey Constitutional Republicans virtual conversation. It's our great pleasure to once again have Rupert Darwall with us today, who's Senior Fellow of the Real Clear Foundation, researching such issues as energy and environmental policy and corporate governance. He previously worked as an investment analyst and in corporate finance, as well as serving as a special advisor to the UK's Chancellor of the Exchequer. The author of two books, Green Tyranny, which we will be discussing today, and The Age of Global Warming, which we discussed last time with Rupert, and numerous think tank reports. Darwall has also written for the Wall Street Journal, The Hill, Daily Telegraph, among others. Real Clear Foundation is a nonprofit organization working in partnership with Real Clear Politics to mount journalistic and educational programs in the public interest. And we will have a contact for Darwall in the video. And once again, Rupert, welcome.
My pleasure, JR.
It's great to talk to you. And as I was saying earlier, Rupert, we really revere your book, The Age of Global Warming and the History. And we wanted to show that. Here it is where you can get it. We'll have the link up to this great book. We thought it was outstanding history. But as I said, Rupert, I think you may have one-upped it with Green Tyranny. And here it is on Amazon. And this is further and more in-depth information, basically a perfect segue from the Age of Global Warming in history, Rupert.
Oh, thank you very much, sir. Yeah.
And we also want to show, this is where you can find Mr. Darwall's articles. He has a couple on Real Clear Energy, which we will provide the link to. And recently he wrote When the New Right Meets the Old Left on ESG, which is another topic. Rupert's going to come back later on in the year to discuss a paper that he had written. And then on the middle of January, he wrote about the Federal Reserve and Jay Powell trying to have both ways on climate change. So this is the most in-depth and accurate information you're going to get on the everything that goes behind the idea of anthropogenic or man-made climate change, the people, the personalities, the conferences that have been created, the NGOs, which we'll talk about as well. So without further ado, Rupert, I want to get talking about, and I want to let the audience know that the New Jersey Constitutional Republicans this year are putting a full frontal assault, if you will, as we are going to present what we call, and as you are a part of, Rupert, the climate clarifiers. Some have called you contrarians or realists, but we believe that you're clarifying the accurate science. And what you're doing is talking about policy and economic and the history and the impact that all of this has. We're also going to be having Dr. Bruce Everett join us. Mr. Greg Wrightstone is going to be, Dr. Wrightstone is going to be joining us, as well as Dr. Willie Soon and Liv Shivev, along with our great friend, Dr. Happer. So we're really committed, Rupert, to getting this information out to the people that climate clarifiers like yourself can give us. And with Green Tyranny, I think it's interesting in the preface, Rupert, you say that you had many compliments on the book, but there was one individual who had said that you may have missed out on a couple of developments in Europe, especially Sweden and Germany. And you'll say in the book, quote, the climate war isn't about climate, it is always and has been about energy. From that to transform modern industrialized societies dependent on low-cost hydrocarbon energy. So tell us a little bit about what precipitated the writing of this book and that information on Sweden and Germany.
Yeah, as I said in the preface to the book, I was contacted by an individual who said, this is a really great book. He said, I can't remember how many shelf meters of books he'd had on the subject. He'd been studying it since 1988, and he praised The Age of Global Warming. But as you indicated, he said that I'd missed out, being an English speaker, had missed out the two countries on continental Europe that were absolutely pivotal in the history of global warming. And those two countries are Sweden and Germany. And to take Sweden first, it is significant that the first politician of world standing to talk about climate change as an issue was not Ted Kennedy or anyone like that. It was, or indeed Al Gore. It was actually Olaf Palme. in 1974 when he was asked by a journalist what he thought would be the biggest issue at the end of the 20th century. And he said climate change. And that set, when I saw that was really, really interesting. So I looked into it further. And there was what preceded global warming for Sweden was acid rain. And what they both had in common was that they were allegedly caused by coal-fired power stations. And then you look a bit further, and there was a reason why Olof Palme and the Social Democrats were so had, if you like, created these two environmental hazards, and that was because they wanted Sweden to have a huge nuclear power program. Sweden is different from most European countries in it has very little coal, and so it was relying on imports. And the story the Social Democrats, Swedish Social Democrats, were telling Swedes was, if we don't have nuclear power, we're going to have coal. We'll have to have coal-fired power stations, and coal does two things: it acidifies Sweden's lakes and streams and so forth, and would kill off its forests. And secondly, it will cause this thing called climate change. So there was politics involved and manipulation involved right at the very start.
And what's interesting too, Rupert, is that Palm was educated in America. He traveled America. He learned a lot about the far left movement, really the new left within the 60s. And there's also, if you do a Google search on Palm, you'll find that there's pictures of him meeting with Fidel Castro. I believe he's actually taking some target range practice with Fidel Castro. So Palm was very sympathetic to the ideas of socialism, was he not?
That's correct. He visited Cuba. He made an inflammatory speech. It was Christmas, I think, probably 1972, where he denounced the United States and President Nixon for bombing Hanoi, and compared the United States to Treblinka, and I mean all sorts of atrocities. He was an education minister before he became prime minister. He was very sympathetic to the education system they had in communist East Germany. At the same time, and what is very peculiar about Palme and indeed Sweden was that his mentor, the person who gave his big lift into the Swedish establishment, was the head of the intelligence services, who was very pro-CIA. And actually Palme was aligned with the, if you like, the CIA wing of the Swedish intelligence services. And he was riding two horses. So in public, he was this neutralist. He was in favor of East and West. He was denouncing the United States. In private, he was actually pro-America. So this is a man who had a secret and was used to secrecy and was used to dissembling. And he was also surrounded by the far left people when he won power again in the mid-70s. Because he lost it. The Social Democrats lost an election for the first time in decades over the question of nuclear power. And you may remember there were Soviet submarines going into Swedish waters. And when he was re-elected, there was a submarine there, and he wanted to denounce this incursion into Swedish territorial waters. But the people in the Foreign Office, the permanent people in the Foreign Office, Foreign Ministry, were Moscow leaners. So this guy is he is an extraordinarily interesting and important politician. As I say, he was the man who, more than anyone else, and Sweden was the country that put, first of all, acid rain and then global warming into the sort of international dialogue. And a further piece of evidence is that the Swedish scientist who wrote the first government report on acid rain was Bert Berlin, who became the first, helped set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and became the first chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
You And just to give a little historical context too to what we're talking about with the Olof Palme as well, and his criticism of the what were known as the Christmas bombings, which were called Operation Linebacker. Nixon's strategy was to bomb Hanoi and bring the North Vietnamese back to the negotiating table, which he was successful in doing, which led to the Paris Peace Accords, which essentially stopped the Vietnam War at that time. And of course, with Watergate breaking out, America didn't follow through with that agreement, and the North Vietnamese knew it was going to happen, as well as Communist China and the Soviet Union, and they decided to break the agreement and begin the invasion of South Vietnam, and we know the history. But Nixon actually, that was saved many American lives that were being butchered in the jungles of Vietnam at that time. So again, the left doesn't like to look at the whole picture. They only like to take what they like to exploit, and that may be disingenuous to the whole historical record.
I think there's a very interesting point there, that when the 1960s student rebellions were spreading across the US and a lot of Europe. So in 1968, you had the student riots in Paris that very nearly brought down General de Gaulle and the Fifth Republic. There was very little student unrest in Sweden. And why is that? Because essentially Palmer and the Social Democrats had co-opted the student movement by essentially parroting what their demands. Mm-hmm. And so Palmer was an extremely sophisticated and canny politician. He knew what he was doing. And after that Christmas speech, when he denounced the United States, he was on the line to Henry Kissinger, telling, look, mm-hmm. the secret, our secret understanding on military cooperation mm-hmm. with NATO and with Washington remains intact. So he was someone who thought he could have it both ways.
Yes, he definitely wore two hats, didn't he? And interesting too enough, Rupert, is that he was assassinated, and essentially the killer, the murderer, was never taken into custody or revealed or known.
Actually, there has been, since I wrote the book, there has been a development on that front, and the Swedish police think they did identify, they have identified Palmer's assassin. But the whole thing was very, very odd. It was extremely poorly handled by mm-hmm. the Swedish police, and there weren't any good explanations for why the police so bungled the investigation.
Now, Rupert, let's talk about Germany. And in the chapter that you have, chapter 2, The Great Transformation, you say, and I'd like for you to elaborate on this, you say, quote, "For America, the message from Essen and the WBGU is to the planet, you must change your constitution." Or to the United States, it's saying you must change your constitution, subvert your democracy, and accept that the Declaration of Independence is now an anachronism in the transformational struggle against climate change, unquote. For an American, which I really believe that this book is directed to in many, many ways, Rupert, that is that's a statement that should get all of our attention.
Yeah, JR, the idea is very, very simple. And that is, no state, the American Constitution does not permit the measures that are required to deliver net zero. Right. They're simply, the federal government doesn't have the power. The states have a measure of independence from the federal government, which is protected by the courts. And furthermore, so you've got the checks and balances of America's 18th century Constitution, which mm-hmm. the founders and the framers put there for a very good reason, to prevent tyranny. And it is for that reason that America cannot do what Europeans expect of America and are doing themselves, which is to basically reorganize the whole of society around the objective of eliminating net greenhouse gas emissions. You simply cannot do it as under the American Constitution.
That's right. Of course, the book is Green Tyranny, exposing the totalitarian roots of the climate industrial complex. And in the book, Rupert, you tie in to how the Nazis influenced this movement.
Yeah, it happens to be a fact of history that the first political party anywhere in the world to have had a wind power program was what was then called the NSDAP, which we know as the Nazi Party, in the Reichstag elections of 1933. And they had advanced ideas on wind power. When I say that they had done a lot of thinking about wind power, and they come up with things that we hear about nowadays, which is, what do you do when the wind's blowing and you don't have enough demand to draw off the electricity? Well, you turn it into hydrogen. So they were talking about a hydrogen economy in the 1930s. And the interesting thing is, why were the Nazis and the thinkers around them so interested in wind power? And my argument is that this reflects a very peculiar thing that was very deep in German culture and philosophy, which is a revulsion, a rejection of the Industrial Revolution, that they wanted to have the purity of a landscape without chimney stacks, of forests and so forth. It's this very peculiar and contradictory thing in Germany of back to the forest, of being clean from industrialization and so forth, despite German industrialization making it the foremost power in Europe. So there is this deep contradiction. I mean, it's almost bipolar, this problem of Germany and German culture.
Staying in line with Germany, talk about the Green Party and their influence on this whole endeavor.
Yeah, so what happened? I mean, it's very important to understand what happened with Germany in 1945 and the utter defeat of Nazi Germany. And for 3 to 4 decades after the defeat, West Germany, the Federal Republic, essentially became the most pro-American state in continental Europe. And it was very, very pro-Atlanticist. So when, for example, the French under de Gaulle was trying to say, leaving NATO and for Europe to be semi-independent from America, the Germans were always, the German leadership, with the partial exception of Willy Brandt, were always saying, our alliance with Washington is the fundamental bedrock of our national security and our whole orientation. Now, that began to change in the 1980s, and 2 things happened in the 1980s. The first is that it was actually a German initiative in response to Soviet SS-20s, these medium-range nuclear missiles that Moscow had put in to Eastern Europe, with the intention of detaching the European side of the Atlantic Alliance from the United States, so effectively to neutralize the American nuclear umbrella, on the grounds that if the Soviet Union fired these missiles at European targets, no American president would risk American cities in retaliation. So that was the thinking behind it, and it was Helmut Schmidt, the West German Chancellor, who called on the Atlantic Alliance to pursue a twin track, and that twin track was putting in American missiles, medium-range missiles, into Europe, and secondly, to negotiate to bring the levels both down and hopefully eliminate them. And that was formally adopted. The twin track strategy was formally adopted. It was seen through, first of all, by Jimmy Carter and then by Ronald Reagan, but it cost the Germans a huge amount politically. So you had a huge peace movement in Germany that was protesting against the sighting of Pershing missiles on West German soil, and a lot of the peace movement had funding and propaganda help from the Kremlin. They put a huge amount of effort into undermining, and they hoped stopping, the sighting of cruise and Pershing missiles in Western Europe. And that led to the fall of Helmut Schmidt, and it led to the radicalization of German politics. And he was succeeded by Helmut Kohl, the CDU chancellor, who who stuck by the policy. And the other thing Helmut Schmidt wanted to do in response to the energy crisis of the 1970s, the oil price shock, was for Germany, West Germany, to have its civil nuclear program. And this again unleashed a huge amount of anti-nuclear protest movement. And in 1980, out of the anti-nuclear movement was formed the Green Party, the Greens, as the first new party. It had been of the extra parliamentary opposition, and it decided it would fight parliamentary elections in Germany. And the leadership of this came out of, there were really two sort of bunches of people. One were the student rebels of 1968, the 1968ers, who were influenced by the post-Marxist Frankfurt School. And the other group were ex-Nazis and neo-Nazis. And the interesting thing is they saw the world in the same way, and they used the same language to describe it. And they were virulently anti-nuclear power, and they tended to be they tended to lean towards Moscow and be hostile to the United States and to the Western Alliance. So you had, if you like, you had this carryover of Nazi and pre-Second World War anti-industrial, pro-wind power and whatever philosophy into modern Germany in the 1980s. And in 1998, sorry.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought, please.
Yeah, in 1998, the Greens fundamentally changed the orientation of West German politics. They pulled it to the left. It meant all the main parties were sort of scrambling to stop votes hemorrhaging to the Greens. And after the unification of Germany, you actually had in 1998 the SPD won an election, and you had the first red-green coalition in Berlin.
And isn't it true, Rupert, that Angela Merkel started out supporting affordable biocarbon energy, also nuclear energy, and then she made a total about-face for political purposes and started to embrace the green renewable agenda?
That's absolutely right. And what was interesting is that her reaction, I mean, on the nuclear power, what had happened is that the Red-Green Alliance, the Red-Green Coalition, had a program to phase out nuclear power. The CDU under Angela Merkel then won an election, and they rolled back the nuclear phase out. And then the Fukushima accident happened, and then Merkel panicked, and she reinstated the previous the Red-Green Coalition decision, the timetable on getting rid of the nuclear power stations. Whereas Helmut Kohl, after Chernobyl, which was a much more serious nuclear accident than Fukushima, and it was much closer to Germany, Helmut Kohl managed to hold the line on nuclear power in Germany. It was Merkel's appalling mishandling of the politics that led to this. But one should also add that Germany became more green, and the greening of Germany in turn has led to the greening of Europe.
And we see today with the issues and the problems that Germany's having by eliminating hydrocarbons, eliminating nuclear power. Aren't they buying more energy than they ever have? They're not self-sufficient at all, because the green renewables can't keep the capacity. They can't generate the capacity that's needed.
That's absolutely right. So what happened is that what you see is Germans prioritize closing nuclear power over energy security and over reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So they prefer to close down nuclear power, import more natural gas from Russia, as they had been doing until last year and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They prefer that than keeping their nuclear power stations functioning, which they could have done for years and years and years. It is an insight into the fundamental irrational nature of green politics, the irrationality, and I would say the nihilism of the green agenda.
No question. And isn't it true too, Rupert, that Sweden had the same anti-nuclear sentiments and essentially took away nuclear power from being able to supply the energy needs of the nation of Sweden?
Sweden actually had the highest per capita amount of nuclear capacity of any country in Western Europe, even higher than France. And as I mentioned at the outset, it was actually the Social Democrats, the left of centre party, that was really keen on had the nuclear power program. But then there was a referendum which had a convoluted wording and has led to a partial closure of some of those stations. And of course, then you get climate activists like Greta Thunberg, who are against nuclear power. Again, demonstrating the fundamental irrationality of this ideology.
That's right. And we know, Rupert, that we are in a minority in challenging and questioning the anthropogenic climate change. And they say, well, 97% of the scientists, which is a disingenuous and inaccurate number of scientists, believe in man-made global warming, and the science is settled. It's without, there's no argument to it all. What I think you brilliantly bring out in the book, in the chapter, Intellectuals, Activists, and Experts, this idea of telling people that there is the science is settled, there's no argument, there's no debate, is exactly what Herbert Marcuse brought about with his book, Repressive Tolerance, when he said that all the ideas of the left are to be tolerated and to be promulgated, but any idea that questions the left's intention must be completely subverted. It must be ridiculed. It must be subjected. It must be eliminated from even being a possibility. And that's the same mentality that the proponents of man-made climate change have imposed upon the climate clarifiers like ourselves.
I'd make 2 additional points to that, Jar. First of all, it's really important to understand that first acid rain, then climate change were brought into the public forum for political reasons. And that's absolutely clear from the case in Sweden. It was weaponizing science or an environmental concern for political ends. And the second point about acid rain, which was the big thing in the 1980s. I mean, people forget about acid rain, and there's a very good reason they forget about acid rain, because the science turned out to be mistaken. And it's really, really, really important, because we're told the science is settled. In fact, the National Academies of Sciences said that the science of acid rain was stronger than for climate change. And the science of acid rain turned out to be wrong. What they assumed was acidification from power station emissions turned out to be, I mean, for example, if you take the United States, the bodies of water, the natural bodies of water which are most acidified, happen to be in Florida, which are not downwind of any power stations. And actually what happened, it was some very brave scientists, minority scientists, dissenting scientists, as we may call them, clarifiers, acid rain clarifiers, who demonstrated that it was actually about land use change. So if you look at the lakes of the Adirondacks, when Teddy Roosevelt was president, he could fish there, and then over a number of decades, the game fish disappeared. And what had actually happened, the explanation was not power station emissions. It was that those forests had in Iroquois, I can't remember the Native Americans who were living there, but Adirondack means bitter bark, and the soil is very naturally acidic. And then came foresters, and they cut down a lot of the forest. They burnt the tree stumps, which reduced the acidity of the soil, changed the pH of the lake. So you actually, all sorts of pleasant things started to happen. Then, of course, the conservationists came and the forest grew back and it reverted to its previous state. And the game fish disappeared. So that was actually the story of acid rain in the Adirondacks. It wasn't acid rain; it was land use change. So I think the acid rain saga is a very, very interesting example, an open and shut book case of the uses and abuses of science to propagate a totally false explanation of an alleged environmental harm.
A question. I just want to touch on the Frankfurt School one more time too, Rupert, because many of our constitutional Republicans and audience are familiar with us talking about the influence. And you say in the book that they came over, and of course Herbert Marcuse was part of that group, but they may have failed in trying to prove that George Washington and James Madison were fascists, which they certainly were. They failed in that regard, and Abraham Lincoln. But what they did succeed was creating an ideological justification for environmentalism, you say, to become a central part of the New Left's and the 1960s counterculture's rejection of capitalism. They succeeded in that, tying in environmentalism with it.
That's absolutely right. The big change with the post-Marxists, like the Frankfurt School, was that under classical Marxism, or what they call vulgar Marxism, the working class was going to be at the vanguard of the revolution. They were the ones they were the class that was going to overthrow the capitalists and defeat the bourgeoisie. But actually what happened is that the working class, particularly in America, turned out to be the most reactionary. They were the ones who were patriotic. They're the ones who went off and fought in the Vietnam War and didn't complain about it. And they were the ones who were consuming what the merchants of kitsch were producing. So the far left essentially gave up on especially the white working class, instead of which they looked to minorities, and they also looked to environmentalism. And so they would go on about ecocide and genocide and so forth. So in Southeast Asia, you saw examples of genocide and ecocide and so forth. So they were saying that they, if you like, painted the Red Revolution green, because essentially the American working class wasn't doing as it was meant to do. So they rejected post-Marxist. The Frankfurt School is a fundamental rejection of and repudiation of the American working class, which is one of the reasons I think environmentalism involves the destruction of blue-collar work, essentially, despite what Joe Biden says. I mean, Joe Biden's a great front for that, saying he's middle class, he's working class Joe, and he's all for supports the trade unions, because the environmentalist project involves the destruction of the working class as a productive social class. And the person who's got this absolutely right is Joel Kotkin in his numerous writings, and indeed what's happened in California. And it's essentially about dispossessing the working class and essentially turning them into neo-feudal serfs, essentially.
And in the chapter Golden to Green, which talks about California, Rupert, you'll provide the statistics for the number of birds that are destroyed through the wind industry and through the putting up of turbines, and losing eagles, which are very, very protected by American law. And New Jersey, recently, we've had some whale washings as a result, possibly, of the construction of wind turbines, and more wind turbines are scheduled to go up. But now there are Republican representatives who are calling in question the science, and in trying to preserve the environment, we're actually hurting it by killing all of these birds.
Yeah, I think this shows the fundamental contradiction of the environmental movement. And there's a chapter in the book where I particularly look at the WWF and how it, from the 50s and 60s, it evolved from being a movement about conserving and preserving wildlife and their habitats to buying in this 1960s idea that the big threat to nature is industrial society. Therefore, we have got to change industrial society. And when you get to that point and you start campaigning against nuclear power stations and so forth, you end up sacrificing the local for the sake of the global. And that is exactly what you're seeing with the New Jersey, the offshore wind programs off the coast of New Jersey. You are sacrificing right whales for the sake of an ideology. And that to most people, there is something fundamentally wrong about that.
Right. And Rupert, if you could discuss for us just briefly the Energiewende. The German Energiewende is essentially accepted by President Obama and the Democratic left.
Yeah, the Energiewende is the energy transformation that the Greens started in Germany in 1998 as part of that Red-Green coalition. Mm-hmm. And because of their obsession with, I mean, and going back to the, if you like, the narrative arc of Green Tyranny, as I mentioned, it started off with the Swedish Social Democrats who were hyping up global warming and climate change in order to get a nuclear power program, which indeed others were doing. If you go back to the Toronto Climate Conference of 1988, they said the answer was nuclear power. Along come the German Greens, who came into being as an anti-nuclear power party, and they fundamentally, and believers in wind and solar. And so they came to power in 1998 in Berlin, and as anti-nuclear and pro-wind and particularly solar, the Germans of the extreme right and the extreme left love solar. And I have a lot in there about, I think Goebbels at one point said, "Behold, there will be a new sun rising in the south." He says, there's something about the sun in German, in that German culture. So they came in 1998, and they had a regime of feed-in tariffs. So the more uneconomic a generating technology was, the more it would get in terms of feed-in tariffs. So solar was right at the top. They completely overdid it, because what happened, JR, is they set off a solar boom, which created China's solar PV industry. The German trade unions were told, oh, there are going to be lots of solar jobs. There were a lot of solar jobs, but they were Chinese jobs, not German jobs. And I should say exactly the same will happen in Britain. With Joe Biden, they put protection in there, so you won't get them from China, which will make the kit more expensive. Which, on the whole, even though I'm a free trader, I think that's a jolly good thing, because it means you'll have less of it. Mm-hmm. So you have that, and then Angela Merkel came in, and as you point out, she was an energy realist. She's a chemist by training, very bright woman, but she won that election, the election that brought her to power. She started off with something like a 20-point lead in the election, and it ended up razor thin. She very nearly blew it. And after that point, she was just driven by opinion polls. Mm-hmm. She completely, with the one exception of Syrian refugees, which had all sorts of repercussions. But essentially, she was guided by, instead of leading opinion, she followed opinion polls, and she doubled down on the feed-in tariffs, and just went even more for the Energiewende. And even though, when you look at German CO2 emissions, there was a big fall in German CO2 emissions, and that was almost exclusively following German reunification, when essentially the old coal-fired power stations of Eastern Germany were closed down. Mm-hmm. Highly polluting, and there was a lot of German industry, East German industry, communist industry, that was non-competitive and got closed down. That is essentially the reasons why, if you want to have a clean power program, as it were, the thing you do is you get rid of communism, because it's fundamentally dirty. But so Germany's gone on extremely costly. The estimate is 1 trillion euros, which is around about $1 trillion. And it's got very, very little to show for it, except it's got the second highest energy retail energy prices in Europe, the highest being Denmark, which has an even higher proportion of wind power than Germany, and a much greater dependence on imports of natural gas from Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's happened since the Ukraine war, since February last year, is that Germany has been cutting its imports of Russian gas. It's increased LNG imports, particularly from the US. But at the same time, and the thing that people forget is it's basically a lot of industries have just cut their use of they can't afford natural gas anymore. So basically, they're shutting down a lot of their industry, and that is the big challenge. That is the big crisis for the German economy. A lot of it cannot, the Energiewende, the green power, and cannot support an industrial economy. So you have companies like BASF, which is creating a massive petrochemical industry in China. You have a lot of German petrochemical investments in the United States, where energy costs are a fraction of what they are in Europe. So you've got the deindustrialization of Germany taking place now.
And an example of the advantages, the gain through free markets and natural occurrences that occur with free markets. You make a great point in the book about the benefits of hydraulic fracking has had in the United States and a couple of our areas that really help the economy out. And you proposed in the book that it may have had a lot to do with keeping the economy to where it was in 2012, that Barack Hussein Obama could get reelected because of the benefits of uncentralized, ungovernment managed hydraulic fracking.
Well, that was that was very interesting. That whole episode is very interesting. And I think one of the key points, I think, is the 2 years before Barack Obama was elected in 2008. And you may remember the 2006 midterms when the Democrats won very heavily. Mm-hmm. And George W. Bush made those speeches about overcoming America's addiction to oil, to fossil fuels. Remember all that? And the energy, I think the energy security legislation and so forth. So you had this before Obama's presidency. You actually had a prelude to it, when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House, and George W. Bush was writing essentially green energy legislation. And then if you look, I would then track through State of the Union speeches to see when fracking first gets mentioned, and it was quite a way into Barack Obama's first term when he suddenly woke up and there's this huge thing going on, and he was saying, you didn't build that, I built it. Do you remember? He claimed credit for fracking. Right. He said this was the federal government suit. Absolute rubbish. It was absolute rubbish. They hadn't mentioned it until it was so big that you couldn't help but notice it.
Yeah. And all the benefits that came from it, and still do, in allowing people to buy energy at affordable costs, which is what we get with biocarbon, and it's hydrocarbon energy.
And JR, it's what's keeping the lights on in Europe at the moment. Let's not forget that. It's
truly amazing. And also, Rupert, as you talk about America, I've thought in the, let me go back to a moment to the chapter prior to that. Now, the whole idea behind repressive tolerance, Marcuse's idea was to silence the critics, silence the right, silence conservatism. And in Spiral of Silence, chapter 23, you talk about how important it is and how imperative it is. We have a problem, but we need to speak. We need to be heard. We need to do what we're doing now. We're discussing this situation. We're getting climate clarifiers like yourself together to talk about that. Talk about that chapter just for a moment.
The Spiral of Silence is the title of a book by a very interesting woman called Elisabeth Noelle Neumann, who is arguably the most important pollster of the second half of the 20th century. She studied a lot of George Gallup's work. She was a German, a brilliant German woman, and interestingly, and she was the big pollster in West Germany after the war. She worked for the CDU, and she worked for every CDU leader from Konrad Adenauer through to Helmut Kohl. She had a bit of a blip during the Second World War, though, JR, when she had a spell working for Goebbels' what was it, Education, Enlightenment and Propaganda department. I can't remember, the Ministry of Propaganda. And Goebbels, they had quite sophisticated ways of sampling public opinion. And what they did was they took people on train journeys when they were on train journeys, and you had those you had little compartments in the trains, and you could have little private chats with people. So they sent out surveys, and they do these to assess public opinion. And she did the same thing after the war, but what she noticed was there was this spiral of silence, so that there's this thing called elite opinion and then popular opinion, and the elite opinion could drive popular opinion right to the margins. And that was through this, what she called a spiral of silence, that when people don't hear their views expressed, they begin to lose the ability to articulate that opinion. And eventually it sort of just gets pushed away into silence. And that is what is happening, and what's been happening in the climate debate. And it's why what you saw also with COVID and the Twitter files and so forth, it's why the left is so keen on censorship and control of information. It is fundamental to what they need to do, is to control information. And that is why when people say, for example, climate clarifiers like ourselves are just talking to each other, say, oh, well, you're preaching to the choir, as if that's a bad thing. Well, I tell you, the spiral of silence shows why it's really, really important to have these discussions, so that people know what the arguments are, that they can articulate them. Because when people stop hearing them, there comes a point where they almost stop believing them.
And as we move into chapter 24, the American Republic, it's interesting that you say, quote, Rupert, America's climate change spiral of silence is a private sector government co-production spanning the entire climate industrial complex, universities, multi-billion-dollar foundations, Silicon Valley oligarchs, NGOs, EPA bureaucrats, law enforcement agencies, elected politicians, and their helpers in the media. That is the composition of the green industrial complex, and it's multifaceted and multidimensional.
And I think it's very important to understand that they don't need instructions on what to do. This isn't a conspiracy. It is people who have a shared ideology, and they know what the project is. They don't need to be told what it is. And they act like, if you like a shoal of fish swimming in the same direction. That's the way to see it. And as I say, we saw that very, very clearly. The degree of censorship and repression, information control and repression that went on during the acute phases of the COVID pandemic. And I've just been looking at, if you look at the Secretary General of the UN made a speech 3 days ago to the UN General Assembly talking about the need to control information on climate. And he said that controlling information represents misinformation represents an existential threat to humanity. So this is going to get worse, JR. That one thing you've got to believe is if they can, they will.
And tying into that, the end of last year, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act here in America, and that puts $370 billion towards climate act. So that's $370 billion American taxpayer money that is putting towards green energy that's predicated on pseudo-science. It's inaccurate science. Clarifiers like Dr. Happer, like what you're doing with the history and the people and the personalities and the conferences and organizations behind it. This is what the American people have to realize. They have to question what it is that they're being taught regarding anthropogenic climate change, because look at the money. And you bring it out in the book. This is hurting the middle class and lower income strata of people and citizens. because of how exorbitant our energy costs are getting. They're rising, the price of fuel, all predicated on this pseudoscience.
I think it's worse than that. I absolutely agree with you, but I think it's worse than that for two reasons. First of all, wind and solar are really bad for the grid. They are really, really, really bad. If you are really concerned about climate change, but you want to maintain a stable grid, you go for nuclear power.
Yes,
you would have it. You go for. And secondly, look at the geopolitics of this. The United States is a hydrocarbon superpower. It has more reserves of hydrocarbon than any other nation on the face of the planet. And so what the Green Project is doing is denying one of the huge strategic advantages that the United States has. It's just giving it up for what? And what we also know that China has a huge advantage in terms of rare earths, that it's quite happy to pollute its countryside and dig up its countryside and use coal-fired power stations to make solar panels and so forth. And so as America gives up its superpower status as a hydrocarbon superpower status, it's boosting China. And that has to be absolutely crackers.
No question about it. You couldn't have said it any better. It's hard to believe that the Chinese are making the money off of this green agenda that's all predicated on pseudoscience. And it's costing American taxpayers. We see it with the gas pump. Rupert, as we wind down, let me ask you about Great Britain. Are there any conservatives in the House of Commons? How about the new Prime Minister Sunak? Is there any opportunity? Do you think is there any conservative inclination on their part to question climate change, or are they just completely bought out into it?
I think, to use that percentage that we're not allowed to use, 97%, I would say 90% of them have been are bought out, as it were. There are very, very few exceptions. The one I would highlight is David Frost, who's not an MP, but he's in the House of Lords, and he writes frequently for the Telegraph. I think he's the only one I've seen who really gets why net zero is fundamentally dangerous and wrong-headed. But the rest of them, Rishi Sunak is absolutely for this. Liz Truss, his predecessor for 49 days, she used the free market talk and cutting the top rate of income tax. JR, the problem is not the top rate of income tax. The problem, far bigger problem, hobbling the British economy is energy policy and net zero. You can cut all the taxes you want, but if you're going to net zero, you're still going to end up in the basket,
right?
In the soup, aren't you?
And of course, net zero, for those who may not know, is the government's aspiration in cutting down carbon CO2 emissions down to zero. New Jersey has the goal of 2050 to be completely zero carbon, which, of course, we show, and Dr. Happert talks about, CO2 indeed is not a pollutant at all. It's a natural ingredient of the atmosphere. And again, the science is predicated on pseudoscience. And what's important to remember is that as we get this information out to people, it's important to realize that the wind and solar, the renewables, cannot produce the power. And you make a great point in the book about the idea of the cells that are used, the construction of the solar panels that are used, the idea that the electricity needs to be used at the time that it's created. There's no means of storing it. There's no batteries adequate enough to do this to the degree that will satisfy the demand that we have. So to think that the renewables are we're going to lead to zero carbon emissions is folly.
Yeah, it is a delusion. If you look at the thing is, the green agenda, the underlying green agenda is anti-growth, anti-industrialization, a consumer society. They believe there are too many people on the planet, that we consume too much, we We have, the last thing they want is abundant, cheap energy. And that is why they push renewables, because it's not cheap and it's not abundant. So there's this, you've got the fellow travelers, as it were, the people who just haven't thought it through, like Joe Biden is saying, the green industrial revolution, opportunities, blah, blah, blah. But actually the hardcore Greens know what this is about, which is about making people poorer. That is the point.
And Rupert, in conclusion, I think the end of your book, it reminded me in reading the last chapter, and I don't want to give too much of the detail away because people need to read it for themselves, but it reminded me of Herbert Hoover's tour of Europe in 1938. He took a tour of Europe to find out what was the sentimentality, what was the atmosphere in Europe. And he could see what was happening with the growth of communism and the growth of Nazi fascism. And he received some advice from some French diplomats and I believe some English diplomats as well. And they said that it was very, very important. The most important thing that America could do would to be provide the example of freedom and liberty to the whole world. Keep propagating and helping your free market, which at that time was under assault from the New Deal. But they said America needs to be that great light, that great light that the whole world can look to see where liberty, self-government, and a democracy can truly be the example for which all the nations of the world, especially at that time when Europe was in danger. But you in the book basically say the same thing, that we need to look to the principles that created our nation, that are found in the Declaration of Independence, and then the Constitution that protects those principles. And in doing that we could ward off this existential threat of the pseudoscience of anthropogenic climate change.
Yeah, that Herbert Hoover episode, 1938, is absolutely where we are today. Europe is lost on the green stuff, on environmental. Europe is completely lost, and there's no pushback against it. You'd have thought with the reality of Russia using the energy weapon against Western Europe, that having been mugged by reality, that people will come to this, and we haven't. They say, well, this shows how we've got to get off fossil fuels faster. And so I do think that the only way that Europe and say Britain will choose a different path, come off this net zero path, is when there is an American president who is very loud and clear and denounces all this thing, denounces climate catastrophism. That is the first step, is saying there is not a planetary catastrophe.
Right.
Because you have to, they use the catastrophe, the existential threat, civilization being wiped out, etc., because that if you accept that there's the possibility of a climate catastrophe, you'll do anything to avoid it. And we know that's BS. We know the climate catastrophe stuff is BS. In 1988, at the Toronto Climate Conference, they compared climate change to second only to a global nuclear war. Well, that's 1988. Right. And has there been anything like a global nuclear war in terms of climate? It's just sort of nonsensical. It's absurd, and it needs to be denounced, ridiculed, and attacked every time it comes up. And ultimately, that comes from political leadership. It will require a political leader in America to have a go at this stuff and just say the emperor's got no clothes when it comes to climate catastrophism.
And Rupert, we talk all of the time about the influence that FDR and the New Deal, his 1932 inaugural address, where he said specifically, paraphrasing, that he would work with the Congress, but if the Congress doesn't give him the necessary means to fight this battle, this war, he said that the Great Depression was a war. We've seen how that word war has been exploited. And in the case of the New Deal, it was exploited to give him more power. It accelerated and gave greater powers to the executive office that our Constitution didn't give. Exploited the idea, if you will, of crisis, of a war, of action that needs to be taken now, even if it means subverting the Constitution, even if it means giving me greater power. That's exactly what has created the whole political environment from which we live in now in America.
Well, yeah. So you have John Kerry saying exactly that with respect to climate change, that it ought to be fought like a war.
Mhm.
And when people talk about war, I think they mean the consequences. There are two consequences. One is curtailing freedom,
Mhm.
because that's what happens in the war. And the other thing is war involves sacrifice.
Mhm.
So it's important that this is taken head on, and the consequences of that kind of language are spelt out. Because one thing that is a fairy tale is that you can go to net zero and everyone's going to be better off.
Mhm.
That is a thing. So in a way, when John Kerry talks about mobilizing as if for war, yes, there is a truth to that, which is that it involves sacrifice.
Mhm.
That we are asking the current generation to make very, very large sacrifices for the sake of future generations. And by the way, if China and India and so forth and other countries keep on growing their emissions, your sacrifice will be entirely worthless.
Mhm.
And that's if the science is correct.
Here is the book, and you're going to want, our audience is going to want to get this book, Green Tyranny. It's the exposing the totalitarian roots of the climate industrial complex. And Rupert, you've done us all a great service in writing this book. And as I said, I didn't think we could top the age of global warming in history, but I think you did it with this. This is a great book. It's essential that Americans read it. And Rupert is talking to us, my fellow American citizens. He's telling us, wake up, get the accurate science, and let's not abrogate our freedoms and liberties, and let's not give up on self-government. So, Rupert, I want to thank you again for joining me, and I hope you'll come back later in the year to discuss a couple of papers that you've written for Real Clear Energy as well.
That would be my pleasure, JL.
Well, thank you so much. And as we talk about, Lincoln talked about liberty, and Rupert and I and all the climate clarifiers agree that we should have the liberty to be able to pay affordable prices for our energy, and we'll never do that. Trying to work towards zero emissions, zero carbon emissions, and in subsidizing green energy emissions. Well, thank you so much, Rupert, and we will talk again.
Great. That was fun.
Thank you very much.
See you soon. Bye, JL.